My name's Samantha Rivera. I'm 19, and in my last year of college, I've always been the type to take risks pushing boundaries, living on the edge. But nothing prepared me for Mr. Adrian Cole. He wasn't just any professor. He had this effortless charm, the kind that made every word he spoke feel like it was meant just for you. His sharp jawline, the way his sleeves were always rolled up just enough to show those veins, and his eyes, God, those eyes, they made you feel seen in a way that was dangerous. At first, I told myself it was harmless, a little crush, nothing more. But the way he looked at me, it felt different, like he saw right through me, and I loved it. One day, after class, I stayed behind. I'm struggling with this assignment. I lied just to keep him there. He leaned in, his breath warm against my skin as he explained something I wasn't even listening to. I was too busy watching his lips move, wondering what they'd feel like on mine. And then he said it. You know, you're different from the others. That was it. The moment I knew this wasn't just in my head. A week later, it happened. After class, the tension between us finally snapped. He closed the door, and without another word, his lips crashed onto mine. It was messy, desperate, like we'd both been waiting too long. I didn't care about right or wrong anymore, I just wanted him. And when he whispered in my ear, "Meet me at the Golden Inn tonight," I didn't even hesitate. That night was a blur of passion and recklessness. His hands, his lips, the way he said my name like it was forbidden fruit, it felt like I was living in a dream I never wanted to wake up from. The next day? Nothing. No glances. No secret smiles. It was like I didn't exist. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched him from across the lecture hall, waiting for something-y thing. But he was stone cold, like the night before had never happened. And then I found out the truth. I wasn't the only one he'd invited to that hotel. Turns out Mr. Adrian Cole had a habit of getting a little too close to his favorite students. I wasn't special. I was just the latest in a long line of girls who thought they were different. But I wasn't about to let him get away with it. He thought he could use me and move on like I was nothing. But I'm Samantha Rivera. I don't get played, I play the game. And if he thought our story was over, he was dead wrong. I spent the next few days pretending like nothing happened. I showed up to class, smiled when he called my name, and acted like I hadn't spent the night tangled in his sheets just days before. If he wanted to pretend, fine. But two could play that game. But behind the scenes, I was plotting. Late one night, I stayed on campus, waiting until his office light flickered off. I followed him at a distance, my heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. He wasn't heading home. No, Mr. Perfect Professor had another secret. I watched as he walked into a dimly lit bar just off campus, the kind of place you wouldn't expect a polished guy like him to be. But it wasn't the bar that caught my attention. It was the woman he met there. Tall, elegant, and definitely not his wife. Oh yeah. Mr. Cole wasn't just a player with students. She had skeletons stacked so high in his closet, they were practically knocking to get out. I gathered everything. Screenshots of our messages, photos from that night at the hotel. Yeah, I wasn't dumb enough to not cover my bases. And even a little recording of him whispering sweet nothings into my ear. But I didn't stop there. I found out about the other girls too. The ones before me, and even the ones he was still stringing along. And then I dropped the bomb. It was a Friday. Right before his big lecture, the one where the whole department would be present, I sent the emails to everyone, professors, admin, even his wife. Oh, and I CC'd the department head just for good measure. By the time he walked into that lecture hall, his phone was blowing up. I sat there in the front row, smiling sweetly as his face went pale, his hands trembling as he checked his messages. He looked up. Our eyes met, and I gave him a little wink. He didn't just lose his job. His wife left him, his reputation was shattered, and every student on campus knew his dirty little secrets. He tried to deny it, of course, but when the other girls started coming forward, it was game over. And me? I walked away like a queen, head held high with not a single regret. It was late. The campus was quiet. The kind of silence that makes everything feel more dangerous, more forbidden. I was in his office again, pretending like I needed help with some assignment I didn't even care about. But we both knew why I was really there. He leaned over my desk, his cologne mixing with the scent of old books and tension. His hand brushed against mine, and for a second we just stared at each other. The air between us was thick, like we were both waiting for the other to make the first move. And then he did. His fingers traced my jaw, tilting my face up to meet his. His eyes darkened, his breath warm against my lips. "You have no idea what you do to me," he whispered. And before I could even respond, his lips were on mine. It wasn't soft. It wasn't gentle. It was hungry, like we'd both been holding back for far too long. His hand slid down my waist, pulling me closer, until there was no space left between us. I could feel his heart pounding against my chest, or maybe it was mine. We stumbled back against his desk, papers flying everywhere, but we didn't care. His hands were under my shirt, fingertips trailing fire along my skin. I gasped when his lips found my neck, his teeth grazing that sensitive spot that made my knees weak. "Tell me to stop," he murmured against my skin. But I didn't. I couldn't. By the time we reached the Golden Inn, I was already lost in him. The door slammed shut behind us, and suddenly his lips were everywhere, my neck, my collarbone, trailing down to places that made my head spin. His hands explored every inch of me like he was trying to memorize the way I felt beneath him, and when he finally... But let's just say, that night, it was everything I'd fantasized about, and more. But I should have known better. Because the next morning when I woke up in that empty hotel bed, reality hit me like a slap in the face. And that's when the real story began. So there I was, standing in that empty hotel room, sheets still warm from the night before, heart pounding in my chest like I'd just run a marathon. I thought I'd feel something: guilt, regret, maybe even sadness. But all I felt was fury. He played me, used me like I was nothing more than a fleeting distraction. But the thing is, I don't get played. I play the game. And if he thought he could just move on like nothing happened, oh, he was about to learn a very hard lesson. I started digging, wanting to find every dirty little detail about Mr. Perfect Professor. But what I found, it wasn't just a string of flings with students or shady hotel meetups. It was worse. Turns out Mr. Adrian Cole had a very dark side. And I wasn't the first girl he'd done this to, but I might have been the last. Because one of the girls before me, she didn't just disappear from campus. She disappeared entirely. Missing, no trace, no goodbye. And suddenly, it hit me: what if I'd been walking into something more dangerous than just heartbreak? What if I wasn't just another notch on his belt, but his next victim? Instead of running scared, I leaned in closer, played the game harder. I showed up at his office like nothing had changed, smiled sweetly when he called on me in class, and sent him just enough flirty texts to keep him hooked. But behind that innocent facade, I was building a case. I recorded our conversations, took screenshots of his texts, and when he finally invited me to another secret hotel meetup, I agreed, knowing exactly what I was going to do. I walked into that hotel room, heart pounding, not with nerves, but with adrenaline. He thought I was there to fall for his charm all over again. But as he leaned in, ready to take control like he always did, I whispered in his ear, "Smile for the camera, Adrian." His face froze as I pulled out my phone, revealing the tiny recorder tucked into my purse, catching every word, every movement. His eyes darkened, but before he could even react, the police burst through the door. Adrian Cole was arrested that night, not just for what he did to me, but for all the other girls he'd hurt. And that missing girl? They found evidence tying him to her disappearance, too. And me? I walked away, head held high, knowing I didn't just survive, I won. Weeks later, I got a letter. No return address. Just a single line written in messy, rushed handwriting. "This isn't over." And suddenly, I wasn't so sure who was playing who anymore. After Adrian's arrest, life felt normal again, or at least as normal as it could be after everything that happened. I was the girl who brought down the predator professor. People whispered when I walked by, but I didn't care. I was a survivor. I was in control. Or so I thought. That note I found? The one that said, "This isn't over?" At first I thought it was just Adrian trying to scare me from behind bars. But then weird things started happening. I'd come home to find my door slightly ajar, even though I knew I locked it. My phone would ring in the middle of the night, but no one was on the other end. And sometimes, when I was walking to class, I get this feeling like someone was watching me. But the worst part? I started finding little things in my apartment. A pen from Adrian's office, a cufflink that looked exactly like the one he wore, and one day, I found a photo of myself sleeping. Panic set in. I went to the police, but they brushed it off. Probably just some sick prank, they said. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just a random stalker. Someone was out there. Someone who knew everything about me. I started digging again, this time into Adrian's life, his family, his friends, and that's when I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Adrian had a brother. A twin, actually. But here's the kicker. His twin had been missing for years. No one knew where he went or what happened to him, but when I found an old photo of the two of them together, I realized something horrifying. The man I'd been with, the one I thought was Adrian, it wasn't him. The real Adrian Cole was a pawn. His twin Aiden had been pretending to be him all along. He'd taken over his brother's identity, his job, his life, and I wasn't just another one of his victims. I was the target. I didn't understand until I found the journal, hidden behind a loose floorboard in Aiden's, old office. The journal was filled with entries, pages and pages of obsession, about me, about how he'd been watching me for years. Before he was my professor, before I even knew his name, he knew everything about me. I knew I had to end this once and for all, so I did the one thing he'd never expect. I invited him to meet me. I sent an anonymous message, pretending like I wanted to see him again, that I missed him. I chose a secluded spot, somewhere I knew I'd have the upper hand. When he showed up, his face twisted in that same charming smile I'd fallen for all those months ago. But this time, I wasn't scared. I wasn't the naive girl who walked into that hotel room. I was ready. As I confronted him, accusing him of everything, he just laughed. "You really think this is about you?" he whispered, stepping closer. "This was never about you. It was about him." "Who?" I demanded, my heart racing. "Adrian," he smirked. "You think I took his life because I wanted yours? No, sweetheart. You were just the bait." Before I could react, he whispered one last thing in my ear. "Adrian's not in jail anymore." And just like that, he disappeared into the night. After Aiden disappeared into the night, his words echoed in my head like a haunting melody. "Adrian's not in jail anymore." I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know who to trust, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I went off the grid, deleted my social media, moved into a new apartment, even changed my name. I wasn't going to wait around for them to come for me. I was going to find them first. Weeks turned into months. I tracked down every lead, every shady connection Adrian and Aiden had, and finally, I found them. An abandoned house on the outskirts of town. Isolated. Perfect for a confrontation. I armed myself with everything I could: pepper spray, a hidden knife, even a burner phone to call the cops when I had the evidence. But when I walked into that house, there they were. Adrian and Aiden, sitting across from each other like mirror images. But they weren't fighting. They weren't even arguing. They were laughing. "Samantha," Adrian said smoothly, standing up like he was greeting an old friend. "We've been waiting for you." My blood ran cold. I realized, in that moment, everything I thought I knew was a lie. Aiden wasn't the mastermind. Adrian wasn't the victim. They were in this together from the very beginning. I was never the player. I was the game. They thought I'd come unprepared, that I'd walk into their trap like the naive girl I used to be. But they forgot one thing. I'd been watching them too. I smiled, pulled out my phone, and hit send on a pre-written text. Within minutes, sirens echoed in the distance. The cops were on their way, and this time there was no escape. But just as I thought I'd won, Aiden leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. "You think the cops will save you?" he whispered. "Sweetheart, we own them." And before I could react, the lights went out. Gunshots. Screams. I don't even know whose. I ran, stumbling through the darkness, heart pounding in my chest like it was going to explode. I could hear footsteps behind me fast, heavy, hungry. I burst through the back door, into the woods, branches tearing at my skin. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Finally, I reached the edge of a cliff, the moonlight casting long shadows across the ground. And there they were, Adrian and Aiden, standing side by side, blocking my only way out. "It's over, Samantha," Adrian said, his voice calm. Too calm. But I just smiled, pulling out the last thing I had hidden: a gun. Loaded. Ready. "No," I whispered. "It's just beginning." I didn't hesitate. I fired. Once. Twice. Both of them fell. I stood there, panting, staring at their bodies. It was over. Finally over. Or so I thought. As I turned to leave, I felt a sharp pain in my side. I looked down, blood soaking through my shirt, and standing behind me was another man. Same eyes, same smile. "You didn't think it was just the two of us, did you?" he whispered. And that's when I realized there were three of them. I woke up in a dark room, tied to a chair, the taste of blood in my mouth. And across from me, all three brothers stared, their faces identical, their smiles cold. "You played the game well," Adrian said softly. "But in the end, you were never going to win. This wasn't a love story. It was a horror story. And I was never getting out alive.